All right, another edition of the Greatest Calls Bracket Interviews. Fortunate enough to be joined today by Dan Shulman of ESPN. Dan, I really appreciate you taking the time. Hope you and everyone close to you is doing well during this very difficult stretch.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Hope you're doing well as well. It's been strange being home for 10 weeks, but bigger things going on in sports right now, and just happy my family is safe and healthy at the moment. That's all that really matters.
Well, as you know, you've got two calls into the round of 32 in the Greatest Calls bracket, one on the TV side, one on the radio side, and I know they're two of your favorite calls. You were telling me to listen back to the Christian Watford game winner and also the David Freese home run. Let's start on the TV side first. You are in Region C. You're matched up against Howard Cosell. We'll talk about that in just a second. A little bit of a generational twist there on the matchup. But real quick, why don't we give people a sense of the Watford call, play that, and then we can sort of discuss the process and what's going through your mind as Indiana knocks off top-ranked Kentucky.
Timeouts for Indiana. Jones. Watford for the win! Yes! Yes! Oh! Unbelievable! Unbelievable! Can't believe it!
All right, so we saw the call there. It's quick because, of course, they had to go full length of the court. You know the shot's going to be going up, probably going to be right around the buzzer. What's going through your head?
Well, basketball happens so fast. I don't normally plan anything out in advance. We did have the benefit right before that of a timeout. So, there's a chance to kind of catch your breath and say, okay, how much time is on the clock? I think you hear me say right at the beginning there, no timeouts left for Indiana. Just try to make sure everybody was on the same page, both in our truck and our crew and the viewers at home. Here's the situation. You got to set the scene. It's the coolest, in my mind, it's the coolest moment there is because they're down by 2. He puts up a 3. The horn's going to go when the ball's in the air. And it's an unranked team at home against the number 1 team in the country. And that's always been my favorite college basketball game is Goliath coming into David's house and David giving him one heck of a battle. And that's what Indiana did. You look back, Victor Oladipo was on that team. Cody Zeller was on that team. But we didn't know, that was early December, I think, that game. We didn't know then where they were headed or how good they would be. And Kentucky was loaded. Anthony Davis, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist, Terrence Jones, and others. So as you hear there, I don't say a ton, 5.6 seconds left, no timeouts for Indiana. And Terrence Jones is the guy racing down the floor, and Watford's the trailer. And when in doubt, I try to say less rather than more, obviously, especially on TV. Radio is different, as we'll get into in a moment, I'm sure. But, I got a little bit lucky. Well, I got a lot lucky. First, he hit the shot. Otherwise, you and I wouldn't be talking right now.
That always helps.
Yeah, that always helps. And the other thing is a silly little thing like alliteration. Watford starts with a W and win starts with a W. If Jones had taken the shot, like Jones for the win is good, but it's not Watford for the win. So I think I just got a little bit lucky, and I didn't plan Watford for the win. Like somebody could have driven to the bucket for a layup, and that would have tied it. So it's not like I knew they were going to take a 3 or anything like that. How Watford for the win popped into my head, I have no idea, but it was very fun. The aftermath when they stormed the court and everything, it's the most exciting college basketball finish of a game that I've ever been at. And I don't remember a lot about the first 39 minutes and 54 seconds of the game. I'd have to go back and watch it. I think about the last 5.6 seconds more than anything else. But I just remember thinking in the moment, what an incredible win this would be, not only for this team, but for this program if they could beat number 1 Kentucky.
I do have to ask you, too. I know you've called a lot of huge games with Dick Vitale, and the two of you are sitting there, and part of what makes the call great is that you're able to actually get the call in before he does the, oh. But I'm curious, as you're sitting there with him at the scorer's table calling this, do you have to kind of hold him back and all say, hey, let me at least get let me get the shot in and then you can go crazy? Or did he kind of realize, hey, let's let the ball get through the net and then I can get going?
You know what? It's like throwing a raw steak on the ground and telling a dog, don't go eat it. It's not going to work. So, I know that going in, as you've said, I've done a zillion games with Dick. And, the ball did go through the basket before he started going. It's funny, if you play that call further, I go for a couple seconds, he goes for a while, and then we don't say anything for a fair bit because just the scene is so incredible. The pictures are so incredible. And I will tell you, there has been the odd time where if I put my right hand on his left forearm, it's kind of like a stop button. He kind of gets it sometimes that I'm saying, I just need a few seconds. But I've only done it maybe 3 times in 25 years. And that day was not one of those times.
So you're featured on the TV side, of course, and you're going up against Howard Cosell, who has one of the most famous calls in sportscasting history. I know I didn't do you. There's a lot of guys I've talked to. I didn't do any.
Glad to win around.
I'm surprised you're talking to me today, frankly. I didn't do any. I didn't do a lot of the guys in this bracket favors. I'm curious about Howard Cosell, and I'm too young, of course, to have seen it and appreciate really his greatness. My dad is a huge boxing guy, and I've watched the fights and I've watched his work a little bit. But curious about your thoughts on watching him call events when you were younger.
I'm not a big boxing guy. Obviously, I know that Howard was legendary within boxing circles. To me, more than anything, Howard Cosell was a Monday Night Football guy. I grew up when he was part of the Monday Night Football team with Frank Gifford and Don Meredith. So there was several years of that. He also did a lot of baseball. But when I think of Howard Cosell, I think of 2 things. I think of football, and I think of his unbelievable intellect and how opinionated he was. He wouldn't hold back on anything. He said it like it was 100% of the time with no regrets. And, those are attributes that not a lot of us have in our personal lives or for broadcasters in our professional lives. So, he's certainly not your so-called typical classic broadcaster by any stretch of the imagination, but he's epic. He really is one of the all-time greats.
One of the great things about being able to do this a bracket like this for me has been the rewarding aspect of doing both a radio and a TV bracket, because you get a lot of different voices in there. As you know, they're 2 completely different mediums. One thing I want to point out, while I didn't do any favors in the matchup, you're one of, I believe, 6 guys in the entire thing who are included in both the radio and TV side. So I think that's a testament to your versatility. And the call we're going to get to in just a second, you've done now 9 World Series for ESPN Radio. The very first one you did was Cardinals-Rangers. Your call of David Freese's walk-off home run in the 11th inning of Game 6 of the World Series is featured in the radio bracket. We'll take a listen to that in just a second. He actually tied it in the 9th inning when they were down to their final strike and their final out. Let's take a listen to that real quick, and then we'll discuss.
Freese leading it off. Crowd in a frenzy. 3-2, a swing and a high fly ball. Center field. It is gone! David Freese, who tied it in the 9th, wins it in the 11th. In one of the most remarkable, improbable baseball games you will ever see. And there's going to be baseball here in St. Louis. Game 7 tomorrow night.
David Freese comes up clutch in the 9th, and then in the 11th, he hits the walk-off home run. It just take us through that moment a little bit and describing that home run.
Well, that is my favorite moment of my broadcasting career. If I get a better one than that, and I Christian Watford is up there. I did the Jose Bautista bat flip game for ESPN Radio, and I'm from Toronto, so that was really cool. But as you said, that was my first World Series. So even though I'd been around for a while by then, your first World Series is a pretty big deal. We all like to call championships, and I was replacing John Miller, who had done it forever. And those are huge shoes to fill. He's one of the best baseball broadcasters of all time. So the series is really good. And then Game 6 is like nuts. I mean, back and forth, 2-1, 3-2, 4-3, 7-4, 7-5, 7-7, whatever it was. And the Cardinals, as you mentioned, were down to their final strike in the bottom of the 9th inning. And Freese hits a triple over the head of Nelson Cruz to tie the game. And if you listen to that call, you'll hear a little hesitation in my voice because he hit it out toward right field, and there's some signage. There's like a golf sign, and there's some white in the sign. And for a quarter of a second, I lose the ball. And in my head, I'm like, oh, man, you got to be kidding me. This is the moment my first World Series might end, and I might screw it up because I can't see the ball. So there's a little hesitation until I see the ball come out of the white, hit the wall, triple tie game. Then they're down to their final strike again on the 10th. Josh Hamilton homers in the top of the 10th. Lance Berkman singles and ties it up in the bottom of the 10th. So this is like the craziest game in World Series history, probably. And then when Freese, ironically, the guy who tied it in the 9th, leads it off in the 11th. And as I think you can hear from the call, I'm pretty sure it's gone right off the bat. I mean, he clubbed it. And again, I got lucky. If the game is in Texas, you don't have that crowd noise behind you, same as Indiana, that crowd scene that we saw. It's still something on radio to feel it, that, the energy and the explosion of noise when he hits the home run. So I got lucky there. And, it's not very often that I yelled out loud on a broadcast or at any point in my life, but that's about all I got in the tank right there, because it was pretty exciting.
So on the radio side of things, you knocked off Skip Carey in round 1. His call of Francisco Cabrera clinching the pennant for the Braves, a terrific call in its own right. But you're on to round 2. You're up against the legendary Jack Buck, longtime voice of the Cardinals on radio, and then, of course, a national radio voice for both football and baseball, a few other sports. His call of Dwight Clark's catch is up against you in the round of 32. I'm curious about your thoughts on Jack Buck. And it's interesting, Dan, because you have a little bit of a connection here. You've got your call of David Freese. Of course, Jack's son, Joe, is calling the game for Fox in terms of TV. And then here you are up against his dad calling the Dwight Clark catch.
Right. Well, again, you didn't do me any favors, but glad to have won around. And Jack Buck, actually, one of my all-time favorite baseball announcers. Tom Cheek from Toronto, Harry Callis from Philadelphia, Ernie Harwell, Detroit, Jack Buck. I remember the first time I met Jack Buck. It was probably the late 90s, and I was doing one of my first Cardinal games on TV for ESPN. And Jack Buck was walking towards me in the hallway behind the booths in the press box in St. Louis. And so I approached him and stuck out my hand, and I said, Mr. Buck, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Dan Shulman. I work for ESPN. And all he said was, "Oh, a baritone, huh?" Just like that. With it, his voice was so gravelly. It was just great. And the nicest man that you have ever met. So I fully do not expect to be in the round of 16. I will tip my cap to the legendary Jack Buck and call it a day. And again, it's funny that he's in there for a football call. As we were talking about, Howard Cosell was in there for boxing. I think I know him more from football, and Jack Buck in there for football, and I think of him more as a baseball guy. But it speaks to his versatility and his talent that he did multiple sports as well as he did. And I would be honored to lose to Jack Buck if that's the way it goes this round.
It's funny. I mentioned to you earlier, you're one of 6 guys in the bracket who are featured in both the radio and TV side. Jack Buck is one of them, and I can tell you that there's a bunch of Jack Buck baseball in there too. The Ozzie Smith home run is featured. It's in the round of 32. And maybe the greatest, a lot of people I think would consider it a favorite coming in, the Kirk Gibson home run. A lot of people think of the Vin Scully call, but Jack Buck's was equally great on radio.
Yeah, you'll be talking about Jack Buck for a couple more weeks, I'm sure. But I remember back in the early 90s being able to drive around, and the KMOX signal was so strong out of St. Louis at night that I could listen to Cardinal games pretty clearly on my car radio when I was driving around in Toronto. If there was no Blue Jay game on or something like that, I'd start looking for a Tiger game or a Philly game or a Cardinal game. So Jack Buck was special. I mean, really one of the greatest voices that our industry has ever seen.
You mentioned Tom Cheek as one of the legendary voices that you've looked up to. That would actually be the matchup for the winner of your and Jack Buck's matchup, and his call of Joe Carter hitting the walk-off home run. I know you're Mr. Toronto and a very proud Canadian, and I did want to ask you about the legendary Tom Cheek in that call, because I know it hits home with a lot of you, and it's one of the great calls in baseball and announcing history.
That's a phenomenal call. I mean, and we'll see you tomorrow night is a phenomenal call. There have been several of them, but Tom's call in the '93 World Series when Joe Carter hits the home run, to me, is incredible. I was in the ballpark like I knew Tom. I had started working at the radio station for the Blue Jays then. I was the pre- and post-game show guy. But that call is so from the heart and so natural and so spontaneous. Touch 'em all, Joe. You'll never hit a bigger home run in your life. I mean, honest to God, I could spend a year trying to write something better and never come up with it. And I think part of it was, as Joe got to first base, he was jumping around and going so crazy with excitement that he kind of missed the bag, came back, stepped on first, and then rounded the bases. And I don't know if that's I think Tom saw that and reacted to that. But not only the touch 'em all, you'll never hit a bigger home run in your life. I mean, it goes without saying, but what a great way to sum it up succinctly and accurately and with great excitement in the moment. And I think it's one of the best calls there's ever been. I'd be shocked if that call doesn't get deep into your bracket. It may not be as well known in the U.S. because it was by a broadcaster for a Canadian team on a Canadian radio network, but I hope people give it due consideration because it was a fantastic call.